Hello, my friends, and welcome to FISHTORY. I'm Alexander Williamson, and today we are going to take a look at something that occurs, especially at night, in the aquarium. Come here.
All right, here they go, winding up like coiled springs and taking off like little rockets. It's like a fireworks show. It's like water simmering as it comes to a boil. These little white dots are actually little insects, little organisms with all sorts of interesting anatomy and features, and yet they're so small we can barely even see the entire organism. So, what are they? Well, they're called springtails. And a lot of times people call them by other names like water fleas, and also other organisms that are similar and small get misidentified oftentimes as water fleas or as little weevils or mites. But what we generally see in the aquarium hobby are springtails. And that isn't even narrowing it down that much because there are hundreds of species of springtails. There are some that live underground, there are some that live only on the surface of water, some that live in the root system of plants, and some that live in the open and in leaves and on the surface of the planet. Now, this is a fascinating topic because I've always just kind of overlooked these and seen them as weird little bugs that kind of are going all over when I service my aquarium at night, and they seem to be attracted to heat and light, and they seem to jump several hundred times their own body length when disturbed when I move plants or, things like a pothos plant that hangs halfway into the aquarium or floating species of botanicals that are in my aquarium. But when I looked closer and thought, let's talk about this subject for the channel and answer what are those little white dots jumping all over and what do they do, I unraveled a big topic. It turns out that these things are quite fascinating, and they're actually at the cutting edge of science and engineering and ecology and biology and evolutionary studies that we're doing right now. Not only that, they tend to always be paired with another organism somewhere nearby that is known as the aphid. Now, aphids you may think of as bugs on gardening plants that come in massive groups and chew up your plants and put a bunch of holes in them, but there are many kinds of aphids. For just as many springtails as there are species-wise, there are over 9,000 species of known aphids right now, and likely double that out there that are not yet described. So, this video will also talk about aphids. It will talk about springtails and aphids living on the margins of our aquarium. What are they? Where do they come from? What do they do? And, it was going to stop there. However, one day, while I was researching all of this, as I got into a deeper and deeper dive and realized a lot of this content wasn't going to be shared with you guys, it was just interesting to me, I looked over at my aquarium and realized that my angelfish were pulling down floating plants. They were pulling them down underwater and giving them a little shake. And I thought that perhaps they were eating the duckweed, which is high in protein. But they were doing this to the salvinia, to the duckweed, to the water lettuce, anything that they could pull down underwater. And soon I realized they were doing this in order to eat the aphids and the springtails off the surface of these plants. Now, they can't do much without arms or hands, so they pull the plant down with one fish. He shakes it around, or she shakes it around, and the bugs then go floating and either let go of the plant because of the shaking and disruption and float to the surface and get picked off by the fish, or the other fish come in and start eating off of the actual submerged plant. I found all of this fascinating, and it made me think, you know what? Our aquariums are a wonder. They are incredible. They are such a symbol of how connected ecology is and how life will find a way no matter where you are with the right ingredients, a little bit of water and a little bit of light. What incredible life springs forth from our aquariums. Now, likewise, as I started to research this, as we got into the second week of research, and I was wondering if anybody else would find these things interesting, I realized that there were a lot of processes going on in the aquarium, from fungi growing on water lettuce and other plants to the actual fish eating and being a part of the cycle of the ecology going on outside the tank, coming into the tank and becoming part of the underwater ecology of the tank. And I want to talk about all of this to you today. So we're going to talk about where they came from, what they are, some fascinating tidbits about their biology and evolution, what we are uncovering that is breaking news that will undoubtedly change medical science, engineering, and genetics that have to do with these creatures, and who would have thought that they live in most aquariums. Also, we'll talk about the pros and cons of having them, and undoubtedly some of you are tuning in because you wanted to know how to get rid of them. How do we kill these or get rid of all these little white dots or all these little black bugs that are on our aquarium leaves? And so we will end the video on that note, how to get rid of them. And actually, it's a fairly humane process for those of you worried about these little organisms. It actually ends up being a fairly humane process because we can't use pesticides in our aquarium. It would be harmful to our fish and shrimp and snails. So we'll go over that to end the episode, but I hope you guys have a good time on this little journey we take, and I hope you find it as fascinating as I have. First up, we will be talking about the aphids. Now, this may seem strange in that you may be saying, hey, I have an aquarium and I don't have aphids. Well, the chances are if you have floating plants or plants growing immersed, that is plants that grow underwater, or plants that float and their roots go into the water and feed from the water, or even just plants like pothos or peace lilies or something like that, where you're using them to pull nitrates out of the tank and beautify the room, well, there's a good chance that there is some sort of aphid in there. Now, as I mentioned, there are over 8,500 known species of aphids. There are even more than this that are out there, and the kind that live in the aquatic realm and the marshland realm of things are very poorly explored unless they have a part of their life cycle that impacts crops. Now, fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately for some people, the most common aphid in the aquarium hobby happens to be related to plum trees. Plum trees, cherry trees, and date or fig trees out there, they are linked in that in the winter or in a season when things dry out severely, so it could be the summer or it could be the winter depending on what part of the world it is, this very, very widespread little aphid known as the nymphaea aphid or the water lily aphid, it lives on lily pads and aquatic plants for the wet part of the year and warm part of the year, and for the hot and dry part of the year that maybe the pond or body of water where it was living on the margins of is no longer there, it will go and seek out fruit trees, generally at the end of summer. Also, it will do this if it just gets cold. So it will head up to the fruit trees and it will crawl under the bark of the fruit trees or under the living cuticle layer of tissue on new branches, as well as sometimes even burrowing into the fruits of these plants. And then once the fruits start to age and rot and fall off, they take the tumble, and the eggs that they have laid in there will actually go down into the forest floor or down into a pile with all the leaves and things as the seasons are changing in temperate parts of the world or subtropical parts of the world, and it will become part of the underbrush and the forest duff, as it were. Now, it's kind of interesting that these plants are part of this little creature's life cycle, in that the water lilies that it seems to prefer and the Prunus genus of trees that it prefers are not necessarily found in the same regions, but because of human activity, it has become nearly a perfect situation near these aquatic plant farms and also near fruit farms, which are surprisingly one in the same regionally oftentimes. Places like Florida, you'll have citrus farms or you'll have fruit and stone fruit farms, and then you'll also have places that are growing water lilies in their ponds. Well, the aphid has a fascinating life cycle, and you may be thinking, Alex, you are getting so far out there on a tangent. Now we're talking about aphids. We saw that, yeah, okay, a fish eats aphids, and that's cool, I guess, but like, really, how important are they? And in order to explain to you how interconnected all this gets, I must first say that, do you need any of this for your aquarium's ecosystem to function? No, you really don't. This is so far outside the scope of our typical aquarium, even biotope, that you'd need to be suddenly bringing in birds and bees and all sorts of different organisms, all the way up to cats and dogs in your house if you're going to start counting how diverse this gets. And we're drawing a line. We're not going to include spiders or beetles and bugs that also are involved. And honestly, we don't need to, because the vast majority of what I want to talk about involves just the springtail and specifically 4 species of water-loving aphids. Now, the main one is the Nymphaea species of aphid, which is also the name of the genus of water lilies in general. They're called Nymphaea. So there's Nymphaea micrantha, Nymphaea, there's all these different varieties, and they include everything from the dwarf water lilies to the tiger stripe or blue, and also some of the different lotus type plants out there. But these little creatures actually create a substance known as honeydew. And part of the life cycle of these creatures is to create and exude a leftover of honeydew, which is some starches, but mostly sugars, left on plants in these little globules of almost like maple syrup like consistency. Over time, as it oxidizes, it can crystallize and get harder. But this is then eaten by things like ants and wasps and bees, which in turn then pollinate the water lilies and the various other plants that are involved in this setup. And those bugs that are creating this honeydew for these other creatures, they're inadvertently creating nursery formula for the very young larvae of a lot of different bees and wasps, where they actually want either granular pollen or some sort of high sugar content extract like this for their young, and that's what makes honey so sweet. Whereas the pollen and the nectar and things that the bees drink, they then regurgitate and also make a sweet substance for their young. Is the primary purpose of why bees do that and why bees make honey. But let's get back a little more focused around the aquarium. So if this is not needed to be known, why am I covering it? Well, it's because I found it fascinating that several issues that have popped up over time keep coming back to this combination. So we talk about aphids that have been around for 280 to 320 million years. They've evolved right alongside flowering plants and fruiting plants, and they have evolved right alongside aquatic plants. Likewise, springtails have grown up along them, and aphids have been preserved in sap and fossilized pitch from different plants, showing exactly what they look like. And with the newest technologies we have, we're able to see what exactly it is that they look like back 200 million years ago, or 30 million years ago, or 2 million years ago, or today, obviously, and get these images in high definition. Now, the other thing that scientists are doing is they are looking at how these creatures have changed, even though it's subtly. They kind of nailed their form pretty early on, and when we talk about springtails in a moment, you're going to hear how they have barely changed at all in 500 million years. They have outlived so many other creatures, dinosaurs, and even alligators and crocodiles. Their form is much older than that, and they had a winning blueprint, evolutionarily speaking, and they've continued to run with it and be successful. So here's a little bit of information before we get into the full life cycle of aphids, which I found fascinating, and the full life cycle of springtails. So how do they get into our aquariums? Why do they show up like this anyways? Well, the first way is on plants. They both have the ability to lay eggs. Aphids have the ability to reproduce with just one female aphid, which is a very common thing to have, is a single female aphid, and we'll discuss that in a moment, why there's so many females versus males. But springtails need both female and male, and then they reproduce. They have a cute little mating dance where the male puts his genetic material all around the female, and then he does a little 1-2-step dance circling her, and if she's impressed, she crosses his circle of gifts, I suppose you could call them, and she then places them into her little reproductive cavity, and from there she will soon have eggs. Now, what is it that the springtails are doing? You know, we just mentioned that they're super small. They can come in on plants. They can come in on water. Their eggs are something like if you looked at a human hair and you saw how big it was if you cut it in half and then looked at it the narrow way. Their eggs are about half the size of that, extremely tiny, and they will lay 30 to 50 eggs, generally speaking, at a time. And they can grow up in less than 20 or 30 days. So you can get a lot of generations of these things quickly. But springtails predominantly eat bacteria and fungi, followed by detritus and basically rotting things. Now, are they beyond eating fresh plants if they have the opportunity? No, but almost always there's something that's breaking down, and since they're such small and essentially simple creatures in their design of their body, what's broke don't need to be fixed, or what's not broken doesn't need to be fixed, I should say. So they have evolved to actually target foods like plants that are currently already breaking down, or bacteria and fungal situations as occur on our floating plants frequently. If you've ever had floating plants and you notice them melting and the edges of the leaves getting dingy and clear or yellow and kind of like translucent with like a milky substance coming off of them, that plant has decided to redistribute all the nutrients it can from that leaf vascularly, all the different vitamins and minerals it can salvage at will, and then it will use those elsewhere, usually towards the top or crown of the plant, while that leaf then starts to break apart. And over time, as that leaf is breaking apart, the plant then at a certain point sends a signal saying, we're done, and it actually uses parts of the cellular makeup of the plant to combine into actual hydrogen peroxide. And just like it will clean out a cut or will destroy living tissue by oxidizing it heavily, this can happen in plants and does. And when you see the plants melting in our aquarium, as I've discussed in several episodes and discussed in depth, basically it does this to cut off the old leaf, just like amputating a limb that's not of use anymore, so that the new ones can grow. Well, once it sent this signal, it starts to digest the leaf on its own, and then soon bacteria and fungi and archaea all start working together to break down the basic building blocks of life that are left in that husk of a leaf, or the skeleton of a leaf that's starting to melt or rot away. And that is what springtails love. And in fact, it is figured that in some environments, springtails and similar creatures in their larger class and families, their order specifically, I guess, they actually consume somewhere between 25 and 30% of the biomass being broken down there, which is nothing to scoff at. That is a lot of the biomass, and it is then being converted into nutritious little creatures. These jumping little creatures, these springtails, are then a great snack for fish. Now, while they are so small that they may not appeal to larger fish, springtails are a excellent diet food because they are full of the nutrients and things. Essentially, they process them just as most creatures do with their metabolism. They process the things they need the most, and they store those in their body, whereas anything wasteful like water or, leftover skeleton carbon of a leaf, they will take that and, their stomachs and digestive systems essentially will rip that apart and turn it into its constituent elements, making a leftover substance that is great for life to then once again build forth from. So you've got these aphids that are creating honeydew. They're attracting things like ants and bees that pollinate the area. The ants are even known to protect the aphids in many cases. Also, it brings in other bugs like ladybugs or just various beetles and things and weevils that will eat aphids and springtails, and that brings in more food for your fish. And overall, the springtails then will start to eat any of the honeydew that doesn't get harvested by other creatures in the food web. They will eat the fungi that grows on that, they will eat the honeydew itself, and they will eat any sort of bacteria that's growing on it for the most part as well. So if it weren't for these little guys, we would not have a way to break down these minuscule things. Now, one of the most important things that we should talk about them doing, springtails, is they're able to walk on water. And this is not because they are holy, at least as far as I know. It's because of surface tension. And these aphids, these 4 species of aphids that we've talked about in particular today, they also have an ability by having these fine little hairs all over them. And even though they're so small we can barely even see the aphids with our bare eyes, on top of them, if you zoom in another 100 times, you'll see that they're covered in these little bristly hairs, and those trap little bubbles of water, which each bubble has a surface area, and therefore it creates sort of a little suit of armor for them and creates a pocket where there is oxygen. So both the aphids and the springtails have the ability to get into the parts of plants like salvinia where they have little tiny hairs or filaments, and they're able to get in there, and then once water is splashed on top of them, or if they carefully slip through back to the and submerge themselves underwater, they will bring with them that little bubble, and they actually are able to survive in that little bubble and work at eating at things like the stem of water lilies. In the case of aphids, they're able to munch on that and suck the juices out of it even underwater in a lot of cases. Now, 3 of the 4 species of aphids that we're talking about don't really do this, and they do have the ability to walk across the water. They do still love living on all of these aquatic plants, and they do make the honeydew, but they are not actually going down underwater and chewing up the plants and causing issues. So really these pests don't do anything other than they shed their exoskeletons every 3 to 4 days, which creates these little ghostly white bodies, and those also seem to be consumed by fungi and bacteria easily. So sometimes you'll see an outbreak, especially on duckweed, salvinia, or azolla. Any of those fine leaf floating plants are very prone to this, as generation after generation, every 3 to 4 days, sheds, and the exoskeleton gets bigger and bigger. The one that is cast off still has nutrients in it, very similar to that of a shrimp's exoskeleton when it sheds. And so the shrimp are also another part of this equation that I find interesting, in that shrimp are known to recycle their own chitin and exoskeletons when they shed in the aquarium. Oftentimes they kind of all scoot in later and start harvesting bits of the exoskeleton of fellow shrimp, or their own exoskeleton as it may be. And they are able to use this as a way to expend less energy in order to create the chemical compounds needed for their exoskeleton to be regenerated. So I've also documented shrimp coming up to the top of the waterline and pulling in these ghostly little bodies or exoskeletons that look like a copy of the adult body. They pull them under the water and they start to consume them. Likewise, it may be that they are also eating either the fungi or the bacteria that's growing there on the honeydew, or they may be eating the honeydew. I just don't know for sure, but we do know that shrimp love pollen granules and a number of other similar substances. So the ways they plug into our aquarium is pretty fascinating. But let's round this off. Let's finish talking about their life cycle and talk about the fascinating part that scientists are studying and learning all about as well, which is some of the trivial and detail parts of their life cycle. So when it comes to the aphids, aphids have 2 modes of reproduction. They either are females and they reproduce only laying female babies once a year, and they get big, fat, and juicy, and you'll see them swell and get clear, and that is all sorts of fat and protein. A lot of times they are cleaning the protein off the surface of our water, and even though it is the springtails that do more of this, and per capita they do far more of it, or pound for pound they do far more of it, the aphids also will harvest this off of the surface of the water as well as out of plants. Now, some of them will use that trick where they have their little diving suit of an air bubble, and they will crawl down into the stem of something like a water lily or a hyacinth plant or frogbit plant, and they will drill a little hole and they will lay eggs, especially if it's getting dry and the pond that they're in is starting to lose its moisture, but the plants have retained moisture and they've kind of folded over on the banks or in the shallows. That's when sometimes they will lay eggs in these conditions, and the eggs will survive, and then the pond will dry up and the eggs will hatch out of there. But by far the more common way that things unfold is at the end of summer, these aphids actually grow wings. Just like we enter puberty, they enter a new stage that their DNA clicks over and says, you're going to turn into a freaky flying bug. And just like salmon transform to return home and spawn, these guys transform and they return to that genus of fruit trees, the Prunus genus. And they also drill holes in the bark and under the bark, as well as in the living layers of the trees, which when done by the millions, can be damaging and cause problems. Now, another fascinating tidbit is that every plant that an aphid has ever fed on, it has a DNA fragment or collection of sorts, a library of that plant in its body, and it will hold on to that for its entire life. And all the babies that are had after this creature's fed on all sorts of different things its whole life, and now scientists can track where these creatures were and what they were eating by doing this eDNA very specific testing method that they're developing. And they're able to understand the life cycle a little better and understand things like how in certain conditions, when there are very, very dense numbers of these aphids and nothing is coming to eat them consistently, they will do things like burrow into the tissue of the roots or rhizomes of things like duckweed, and they'll lay their eggs there, and that will then cause the plant to die or to become weakened. Generally, it's not a good idea to kill your host as a parasite until your babies are born, at least. And for the most part, they don't actually kill things. However, where they are a foreign influence, where there's not been these exact aphids and these exact floating plants, things like the water hyacinth is foreign to them. And so when they actually burrow into it, they tend to spread viruses and diseases that they carry in it also. And oftentimes they kill those plants. Now, scientists have been trying to figure out how to stop hyacinth and water, everything from, Riccia fluitans to duckweed, salvinia, you name it, trying to stop these kinds of plants from choking out waterways. And it turns out that they may be able to design a virus or a compound or chemical that deteriorates those rhizomes and stops the little plants one by one from being able to reproduce. So they're actually doing research into studying how to stop pest plants that clog up waterways with this. Likewise, what it does is it thins out some of the water lilies or lotuses over time, and then it allows stem plants to grow more frequently in waterways, which then put down root. And thanks to all of the pooping going on and all of the fish eating insects and then pooping, creating mulm and essentially rich, fertile dirt at the bottom of a river or lake or aquarium, it then creates silt that the plants live in and nutrients that the plants live off of, and yet those plants become enriched with the very nutrients that the aphids needed in the first place, and that the springtails also have evolved to rely on being there. And that is how it is kind of this closed loop in a way that's kind of fascinating, that whole cycle. Now, I mentioned that we're also studying these things and trying to learn all about them, and things like how do they jump hundreds of times their own body length in the case of springtails. What are they doing? Why are they needed? And the answer to a lot of these questions, they're finding problems that they didn't know they had a need to answer necessarily, but they're looking at nature and biomimicry, and they're thinking like materials, for instance, like a memory metal that gets heated to a certain temperature and then pops into a certain arrangement or shape or crystallization pattern at a molecular level. And they're finding that there are similar links in how the legs of a springtail are oriented to transfer so much kinetic power into such a tiny little creature. And for a long time we thought they just flung themselves aimlessly, but now we know with slow-mo cameras that they actually turn and orient in the air, even though they've done somersaults sometimes dozens of times, and anywhere from 10 to 100 times their own body length. They're flying up and over and out of the way of things or over to a new place. It's quite amazing to watch if you can find some adult springtails that are probably a millimeter or half a millimeter long, and you can just barely see them with the naked eye hopping on the surface of calm aquarium water. So I promised you, though, that I would talk about how to get rid of these, and the simplest way to explain that is don't allow calm water in your aquariums. Don't keep a warm, damp place near your aquarium. If you have potted soil in your plants, you can use diatomaceous earth, which actually draws the water out of the cells of these creatures. Both the aphid and the springtail need to stay in either a humid environment or a wet environment, and diatomaceous earth actually has that ability to suck the moisture right out of them when they come into contact with it. So by having a couple potted plants of this, or by using it in your substrate, and thus it just also being on the in your fish room in general, there's a better chance that you will repel these creatures, which have also learned to just avoid the stuff, chemically speaking, when they sense its constituent parts being in the area. Now, another thing, flow will stop a lot of these plants from even growing or taking hold, the floating ones specifically, but it also knocks these little guys off their leaves. And then having any sort of fish that eats at the top of the water, that will ensure that these guys get dealt with. As soon as they leave their leaf, there's probably someone waiting for them. And if you do not feed your fish store-bought foods for a few days every couple weeks, or maybe even every week, you can withhold food for 3 or 4 days, and they will start to go back to their natural foraging habits and behaviors. And I find that to be some of the most rewarding and fascinating parts of fish keeping and fish breeding, is to watch when they do that. Not only that, they're putting on a whole bunch of protein if you've got a lot of these things, and they're getting that exercise as well as mental stimuli, so there's less fighting and aggression amongst one another, and also there's more of a trigger for spawning because the males have had access to resources and looking good and being healthy, and the females likewise the same, and so they have more eggs and more offspring. And then the offspring themselves are much more likely to survive when there are springtails and or aphids around, because many nanofish that they've examined, including the zebra danio, it appears that up to 25 or 30% of their gut diet is little springtails and or aphid and little no-see-um-like creatures. So they are getting a lot of their protein from this when they're very young. Now, as they get bigger, it's not worth the meal quite as much, but it still does cause some of them to be curious and to go for some of these easy snacks once in a while. Now, the other way to deal with getting rid of these is to take the plants you have, if you notice an infestation going on, and you simply take them, put them in a colander or strainer, and then place that in a sink with a stopper in it, or place that into a larger bowl of water. And it could be cold water or it could be semi-warm water, but probably a little bit warmer or a little bit cooler than your aquarium temperature will help to shock these bugs. And if you have any sort of oil, it's known that neem oil will kill these guys very easily, kill aphids very easily. However, we don't want to use any pesticides or too many oils, because it can be detrimental to our fish, and especially shrimp and snails, which are also invertebrates with exoskeletons and some of the same sensitivities that we need to worry about in the case of what we're trying to get rid of. So if you really want to get rid of them, you could add a little spot of some sort of oil, whether that is a avocado oil or olive oil. Put a little bit of oil on the water surface, whisk it, and then when you take your colander of these and dunk it, they're going to float in that basket, and you can shake it around, and that oil will be on the water surface, and it will make it so that if it's been stirred up, that the surface tension no longer holds the weight of the bugs. Just like fruit flies can get trapped in apple cider vinegar and or soap that you have floating on it, it's the same exact principle. It's just using soap on plants you're going to put back into a aquarium full of fish may not be the best choice. You may want to use something a little less abrasive, like an organic food-based oil, which still reduces the surface tension of the water. After this, you shake it around and you basically submerge the plants as much as you can. Let as many of the little critters float up in their air bubbles off the leaves to the top, and they'll be kind of squirming around the top of your sink water or the tub you got, and then you can literally move it off to the side and try to pick it up without getting many of those floating guys back into the basket. Do this a couple times and you'll have gotten rid of a bulk of them, and by getting rid of any of the ones with wings, you will automatically be getting rid of the aphids that are going to reproduce and that are going to create all females. And when the aphids reproduce 20 to 30 times a year, and they are female aphids without wings, they're using their energy to make eggs, and these eggs are half male, half female. However, when those babies get together, none of the males will pass on their all of their genetic material, and actually they will have females. So this is a very fascinating case where only the babies that are born in her clutches that are not annual, but rather her common, frequent, smaller clutches, those are the only ones where males will occur. And while the male is needed to fertilize her for a year, none of his babies will come out as males. Any of the eggs laid up in the fruit trees at the end of their cycle, like we talked about, or in the stems of water lilies and things, or in the rolled up leaves of water lotuses, none of those eggs are going to be male. So you're left every year with an overwhelming, like 99% population of females, which means they can reproduce at insane rates. And that's why we see so many aphids at a time in certain places. All right, you guys, I hope this was interesting and not too far out there. If you like these deep dives, and you know, even if I have to kind of come up with something for the video, for the graphics after a certain point, I just don't know what to show you anymore, because we're kind of rehashing holistic topics and details that maybe don't have the easiest way to explain the concepts of on film other than just showing aquariums. I want to know, is that okay? You know, it saves me a lot of time rather than having to look up every time I say the word springtail showing a springtail. You know, I'm going to start off the episodes with as much detail as possible, obviously, in the editing, but back it off a little bit on these super deep dives unless it involves something like a chart that is useful or data that I found useful as well. So that is this big ol' honkin' episode of all the little critters that live above the water in your aquarium and what they're doing and how they're working with one another. And we barely even scratched the surface, pun intended. So if you want to know more about anything specific, let me know. And as always, thank you so much to you who come to the channel, look for what's been posted recently. I know they're not sending out alerts to hardly anybody. And if you do that, you come watch the videos, you like, you comment, and even those of you who go above and beyond with the memberships, I mean, thank you so incredibly much. It is not possible without you. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you guys next time on FISHTORY.